Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we welcome you once again on the Wednesday evening, and it is a Wednesday evening edition of Wednesday nights with Inayat Wadi. And this evening, we are staying with the topic of Palestine. And the last 3 weeks, we have unpacked a lot. We've talked to various organizations, we've talked to people, we've talked to academics. And once again, this evening, we are going to be unpacking the topic and we're going to explore the various narratives surrounding the Palestinian question. And tonight, we are going to be focusing entirely on the Jewish voice for Palestine. And there are certain questions that obviously we will be asking. What does this actually mean for a people of the Jewish faith? Now, obviously, there is a religious dimension to this discussion, but also the political angle. And recently, why have we seen thousands of people, particularly in the United States of America and some of the other countries, even in South Africa, where we've seen people of the Jewish faith taking to the streets, making their voices known? Now, obviously, these are striking questions, and many believe that what is happening is wrong, and it is clearly a case of ethnic cleansing. And some of the key questions we need to ask is what has changed? Now, clearly, we know the Black Lives Matter movement obviously has claimed a lot of credit for helping masses of people understanding things like racism, structural oppression, and the like as well. But many, many young voices obviously now coming out into the open. And this evening, we are going to be having a panel, and the panel obviously consists of academics, and we also have got a rabbi who is part of the panel this evening, and we've got Professor Jeff Halper, director and also of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. We've got a Rabbi David Weiss, activist and spokesman for a branch of and a group called Naturai Karta. And we also have got Professor Rand Greenstein, associate professor with University of South Africa, author of Zionism and its discontents. To all the panelists out there, Rabbi David Weiss, Professor Rand Greenstein, and Professor Jeff Halper, good evening to all of you. Welcome to the show, and we do appreciate your time with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, I just want to go around quickly, just in terms of introducing yourselves. And I see Rabbi David Weiss, you are top of the screen. And if you could just a few minutes, just a brief introduction about yourself.
Yeah, with the help of the Almighty, I pray to the Almighty that He should bestow upon me His truth, His wisdom, that I may be worthy of conveying His message and so sanctify His name. My name is Rabbi Yisrael David Weiss. I am from a spokesperson for the Ture Karta Jews United Against Zionism. My parents, my parents are. Are you still seeing me? Because my
Yes, I can see you. I can hear you loud and clear as well.
Okay, right. Okay, my parents are both from Hungary. My mother's family, actually, they very Orthodox, and they were killed. His parents, my father's parents, were killed in Auschwitz. When the Nazis came into Hungary, he escaped and met my mother in the United States, and they got married there. And I was brought up in a very religious, God-fearing family. My father had the privilege of knowing one of the greatest fighters in Europe against Zionism, the Minkacher Rebbe, Zatzal Rabbi Chaim Elazar Shapiro, and basically I grew up in a very religious environment, and got married, and my wife is also very religious environment, and they're all very anti-Zionist. That's basically, and we felt the chief rabbi of Palestine himself, going away from myself just, but the chief rabbi of Palestine, one of them in the series of chief rabbis that were there, was Rabbi Teitelbaum, Rabbi Teitelbaum, blessed memory, and he was the chief rabbi after the state of Israel if the was ratified by the United Nations. Now, I have to clarify this. Israel has a rabbinate, they say, and they have a chief rabbi and stuff, but that's all window dressing. That's nothing that we'll get into all that. But there is a rabbinate and a chief rabbi, and one of the chief rabbis, who from the true rabbinate that has nothing to do with Zionism, that is opposed to Zionism, that is existing till today, his name was Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. This Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum himself moved away, remaining with the title of chief rabbi, moved to New York, and he urged constantly that the religious people should stand, religious Jewish people should stand up and speak out and let the world know that we are that Judaism is not to be confused with Zionism. It is diametrically opposite. It is contradictory, and that it's a really one of the basic requirements, and that even at the cost of our lives, we really have to let the world understand that what's happening is not in our name. So with God's help, I try to go around the world and let people know. I've been doing this for many years, thank God, to let the world understand the difference between Judaism, the religion, subservience to God, and Zionism, this relatively new movement. Judaism is 3,000 years, and Zionism is a little over 100 years, that this movement is really not representative of our religion. On the contrary, it breaches all the laws of the Torah, and that's our godly mission, and that to speak up the injustice, what's being done to the Palestinians, etc., is not in our name, and we oppose it.
Well, thank you very much for that, Rabbi. Professor Ren Greenstein, if you could just unmute your button and just a brief introduction of yourself, please. I think Professor Ren Greenstein seems to have frozen. Professor Jeff Halper, good evening to you, sir. Just a brief overview of yourself, and obviously you and I have spoken many a time on the Drive Time show, but wonderful having you on a panel discussion.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm an Israeli anthropologist, and I'm the head of, as you mentioned, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, which is ICAD, which is an Israeli organization that fights the occupation and focuses especially on Israel's policy of demolishing Palestinian homes. But I'm also a founding member of the One Democratic State campaign, which is a Palestinian-led initiative that says we have to transform Zionism and the state of Israel and the occupation, all of historic Palestine, into a democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens. So those are kind of the two hats that I'm wearing tonight.
Well, definitely, and I'm sure we're going to benefit a lot with the discussion that we are going to be having with you. And I see Professor Ren Greenstein is connecting. He is connected. Professor Ren Greenstein, good evening to you, sir. Welcome again. And just a bit of an overview. I know you've written a number of books. You've written extensively on the subject matter that we will be discussing tonight.
Yes, thank you. I teach at Wits University in Johannesburg. My academic work deals with various historical issues, including the rise of Zionism, opposition movements to Israeli policies and Zionist historical settlements, the equivalence between Israel and South Africa. And so I approach the issue from a comparative historical perspective. And I also participate in various forums that offer critical perspective and analysis of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and in the context of South Africa and globally as well.
Yes. Now, obviously, Professor Greenstein, I'd like to actually begin with you, and obviously looking at two issues here. One, obviously, is in terms of the narrative as far as Israel is concerned, and the second is challenging the narrative. Now, we know that there is a dominant global perception and perspectives as far as the Palestine-Israeli question goes. But just to understand conceptually two issues here. One being the ideology and second, the occupation in terms of this ideology of Zionism at this point in time. So if you could just possibly paint us an overview or a background on this perception and the global perception, obviously, as far as this Palestine-Israel question goes.
Well, the dominant perspective among the majority of Israeli Jews is that Zionism is simply a national movement that represents their interest and their entitlement to have their own state, their own freedom, their own independence. Obviously, from the perspective of Palestinians, that is not the case, because the right to self-determination of Israeli Jews or Jews in general, as exercised by the state of Israel, comes directly at their expense. So there is a conflict which is inevitable if we think about the history of Zionist settlement in Palestine, which came against the will and at the expense of the indigenous people of the country, Palestinian Arabs. But it's important to realize that from the perspective of most Israeli Jews, their national movement, which they call Zionism, is a legitimate national movement like all other nationalist movements. Now, within this context, and that I would say, I can't give you precise numbers, but I would estimate that at least 95% of Israeli Jews uphold this perspective that regards Zionism simply as the expression of their national identity. Within this context, there is obviously debate about different policies. So not everyone supports the occupation of 1967, for example. There is opposition to it within Israel. But a more radical opposition, which challenges Zionist ideology itself and the constitution of the State of Israel as a Jewish state in which Jewish citizens have priority and have political supremacy, that is the underlying fundamental belief of most people, and only a relatively few people and movement challenged it. So we need to make a distinction between opposition to Zionism, which is definitely a small minority group among Israeli Jews, and opposition to the occupation of various other policies of the Israeli government, which attracts larger sort of criticism and mobilization against it. Within the context of Israeli society, we also have to take into consideration, it's not obviously entirely a Jewish society. 20% more or less of Israeli citizens are Palestinian in origin, and Israel also controls a large number of Palestinians who are not citizens, who live under military occupation in various guises. And in addition to that, there is another section of the Palestinian people who live outside of the boundaries of historical Palestine because they became refugees in the course of the 1948 war. So when we look at the Israeli-Palestinian situation, we have to look at all these dimensions. What happens within Israel in its pre-1967 boundaries? What happens in the current situation where Israel controls all the territory of historical Palestine, including the West Bank and Gaza, which are under military occupation, and the condition of refugees who live outside of the boundaries of historical Palestine. And within Israeli society, Israeli Jewish society, there are various perspectives about each aspect of this situation. Vast majority, as I said initially, do support Zionism in the sense that they regard it as the expression of the right to self-determination of Jews globally and Israeli Jews in particular. So we need to disentangle this complex of relationship and talk about Zionism and opposition to Zionism, but also about opposition to specific Israeli policies, which is more widespread than the opposition to Zionism as an ideology.
Thank you for that, Rabbi Wise. just to bring you into the discussion, and as Professor Ren Greenstein mentions, the expression to the right to self-determination. Now, obviously, apart from the ideological aspect that we are talking about Zionism, there is also the religious aspect. And obviously, you being the man of the cloth, you being a rabbi, and obviously, you've articulated that in your introduction as well, where you spoke about obviously the fundamental difference between Zionism and Judaism. And again, the dominant obviously, as Professor Greenstein mentions, 95% of Israeli citizens obviously recognize the fact that the right to self-determination. But the key issue here, this is obviously being done at the expense of an occupation that has been brutal, an occupation that has been unjust, and that has been taking place for over 70 years.
Yes, with the help of the Almighty, I I think first of all it's really crucial to understand to go to the root and when you're trying to decipher, when you're trying to explain the situation and try to come to a solution, we really have to go to the root of each issue. Now, firstly, it really, this, like I say, the first issue is that it's called the Jewish state. It is called, they call themselves a Jewish state. They use all the symbols. They use the Star of David. They use Israel, which is Jacob. They use the biblical terms, and so forth. And they wave the Bible as a deed to the land and as to legitimize their occupation. So first, I think it really is critical, because this is the root of the whole issue here, is to clarify and to debunk this issue. Zionism is a transformation from the religion Judaism. Judaism is a religion of 3,000 years. It is where Moshe Rabbeinu went up on Mount Sinai, brought the Torah to the Jewish people, where we made a covenant with God to be subservient to Him and to uphold all the laws of the Torah as it is God-given, and that we never able or permitted to change in one iota the laws of the Torah. And we hold this precious and holy till to this very day, that we do not change. We conform to the Torah in the changing different ages. If it has to do with computers, with electric or whatever, we much less see that it confirms to the Torah when it comes to the Sabbath. We were not allowed to open a lot, use fire. So how does that the issue of electric, how does this? So in everything we conform our lives to the Torah, but it is clear that that is what it is, a covenant with God to be subservient and uphold the Torah. And the Torah, there is laws that you're not allowed to steal or to kill, and that there is a concept that God took us into the Holy Land when we left Egypt and required of us to go there. And then, but he stipulated, as all the words of the prophecies of Ezekiel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, all of them speak about. Anybody just looks at the books of the prophets, that we were warned that we have to be on a very high level of holiness to be able to remain in the land that we consider the Holy Land. And if we're not on that level of holiness, then the Almighty warned us that the land will reject us through its sensitivity of that it needs this high level of holiness. And that happened with the destruction of the temple. Temples. There were two temples, one built by King Solomon, then there was a second one. It was around 2,000 years ago. And we were put under oath by God at that time. It's prophecies of King Solomon, that we are 3 oaths not to return en masse. We are not to attempt to leave this exile that we believe is a godly decreed exile, that we are not to try to return and reinstate a Jewish sovereignty. Secondly, we're not to rebel against any nation. We have to be loyal citizens in every country we reside and pray for the well-being of the nations that we reside. And thirdly, not to make any attempt to end exile. So for 2,000 years, we went through many trials and tribulations, Inquisition, the Crusades, but we never, as dictated to us by our teachers, our rabbis, leaders of Judaism, of the Jewish people, and that we are not to attempt to reinstate, to create a Jewish sovereignty anywhere in the world, But certainly, we're not allowed to, one of the oaths is that we're not allowed to return en masse to the Holy Land. We are not to create a so-called Jewish sovereignty in the Holy Land. So that would have been, even in the case of an empty, an uninhabited land, we would be forbidden to make a Jewish sovereignty. It's one of the essences, it's one of the critical issues of Judaism. Now, on top of that, the Torah says that we're not allowed to kill or steal and to take another people's land or oppress and so forth. And God says in the Torah many times, we have to emulate God. Just God is compassionate. Mahu racham, afat racham. We have to be compassionate. On top of that, we have to, one of the rules of the Torah is that we have to show gratitude for good done to us. And the Muslim lands in the times of the Crusades and Inquisitions, it was the Muslim and Arab lands that opened their doors and embraced us, and we were able to flourish in these lands for these many hundreds and hundreds of years. So we have to show gratitude and thankfulness. So to come along and then to decide to create a Jewish state in Palestine, in the Holy Land, which was then first it was under the Ottoman Empire and so forth, to go along and then to vilify the people of that land and say that they don't want the Jews to establish a land there, it's because they hate Jews, is the most repulsive, repugnant, and unacceptable claim. Because, as I say, we were for hundreds of years, when there was no human rights groups or anything, we were embraced and we were able, as distinctly religious Jews, to exist in harmony with the Muslim people in all the many Muslim lands, and including in the Ottoman Empire, including in Palestine. So the issue then, Zionism, which came along a mere 100-odd years ago by a group of people that decided that they were totally estranged from the Jewish religion. They had a concept. They have a plan to reach some type of a sovereignty, a Jewish homeland, a homeland. They call it Jewish, not that they practice the religion, but they wanted to make their nationalist homeland. And they were looking for someplace practical. First, they wanted to go to Uganda, Patagonia, but they realized for practical purposes, it would be better to go to Palestine because you need massive backing to create a land. And then they can turn to the Christian evangelistic Christians and Jews who don't know their religion, basically, not practicing Jews as a whole. And they'll claim that this is the land that God promised us. And they'll get a lot of backing and support, and they'll be able to create a state. By doing this, they are breaching all the oaths that Jews were under for 2,000 years. We're not allowed to return en masse, as God warned us. We're not to rebel against nations. And we're not to create a Jewish state. And on top of that, we're not allowed to kill or steal. So all the concepts of Judaism, this being subservient to God, to being a nation, a holy nation, which what Judaism is, Zionism, in the transformation to nationalism, breaches all of these laws, and it's totally not Jewish. It's like called Buddhist Judaism or something. It's totally not that I'm just comparing to Buddha. It's totally not that. It's just incongruous. It doesn't make any sense. Yet, for their purposes, being that they don't have any morals, godly morals, so they don't care that they're abusing and misrepresenting and misconstruing and really falsely using a name that's not theirs. They decided for practical purpose, they use the name Israel, they use the Torah willfully, knowingly, because these people were not ignorant, knowing that they're really creating, perpetrating a criminal act, because it's not Judaism, and they have really no right to use this religion for their purpose. But it is what they did, and that is how they went and created this Zionist state of Israel with waiving the Torah and falsely using the identity of Judaism. And that in that case, therefore, all the rabbinical authorities universally, right at the beginning, stood in opposition. We have compiled a book called The Rabbis Speak Out, which is a compilation of the major rabbis around the world, 130 years of religious opposition. It's more than 130 years now, but we have from all the rabbis from every country, from Europe, from Lithuania, from the Hasidic rabbis, from Middle Eastern countries. Everybody stood in opposition to this state. They said it's false. This is not a Jewish state. And the culmination of this is that when the Zionists were finally able to get the British to help them establish the state, and eventually the United Nations was ready to ratify the state, the chief rabbi of Palestine at the time, his name was Rabbi Dushinsky, of blessed memory. We have pictures of their meetings in the United Nations, delegation that met in Palestine. And we have the documents from the United Nations, where it's in the United Nations documents, where the chief rabbi at the time of the Jewish communities in Palestine, again, not referring to the Israeli rabbinate or their chief rabbi, which is a farce. It's window dressing, just like they use the name Israel and the name Judaism or the Star of David. But here, the chief rabbi of our communities stated, I'm just going to quote one sentence. He said, "We furthermore wish to express our definite opposition to a Jewish state in any part of Palestine." This is what he pleaded, Chief Rabbi Yosef Tzvi that's July 16, 1947, before the state was ratified, when the United Nations was studying the issue, and they were totally ignored. But let you know that they represent, I can't say with all due respect how much percent it is, but it's quite large, and I doubt it's that only 5%. There is a fact that our communities there that were living there, all these till the time of Zionism, the communities were almost entirely, they were religious communities. The only Jewish religious people came up to the Holy Land as a whole, because the purpose of coming there was not to become rich. It was a very sparse land. It was they went there to practice their religions. They came from around the world, rabbis who retired and so forth, and they aspired to live off their years in holiness. So whether it was Sephardic, Ashkenazic, that means from Europe, or Middle Eastern countries or African countries, it was always the very holy, the elite of Judaism that came with their students, and that was what the community was comprised of. And they all stood in opposition to this new movement of Zionism. And that community is still today. It has grown in leaps and bounds, because added to that was the many people who escaped from Hitler and so forth that came up there, the religious communities, and many of them simply don't register. They're invisibles. They don't register with the Zionists at all. They don't partake in their elections. They have nothing to do with them, because they look at the state of Israel as something that is unacceptable, that is a rebellion against God. When that rabbi passed away, Rabbi Dushinsky, and then there was Rabbi Teitelbaum, who I earlier mentioned, who was living in New York with the title Chief Rabbi. When he passed on, the next rabbi was a Rabbi Weiss, not a rabbi, a relative of mine, and he was taken up in year 02 with Misparim. He had hundreds of thousands of people. This is just the street that there was over 10,000, but the streets were covered.
Yes.
All the streets.
Rabbi, can I just stop you there for a minute? And I just want to bring Professor Jeff Halper into the discussion. Now, obviously, Professor Jeff, when one looks at the occupation, for the last 70 odd years, and one conceptual issue that we'd like to understand is the concept of colonization and the concept of settlements. Because, we've seen the term settler colonization, and especially recently in the wake of what has happened in Jerusalem, in the neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and the like. And this term settler colonization seems to be featuring a lot more. Now, obviously, in terms of, your area of expertise, the organization that you belong to, just to help us understand what does settler colonization really mean in the context of what we've seen happening.
All right, let me just step back for a second and put this in a bigger context, because I mean, you're talking about Jewish voices from this country, or Jewish voices on Zionism. I mean, you've noticed, I think, I don't want to speak for Ron, but I think I'm right. You've noticed that you have two secular Jews and a religious Jew. So obviously we have different stories. I mean, Rabbi Weiss's version is true for him and for his religious community. It doesn't really represent us, I think. Even though we're anti-Zionist, again, I don't want to put words in Ron's mouth. I'm an anti-Zionist, but I'm secular, and I'm still Jewish. So Judaism isn't only a religion. And I want to put this just in a minute, and then I'll go on to the main thing. And that is that, Zionism was a secular movement. It was even an anti-religious movement, you might say, because it's true. Rabbi Weiss is right that for 2,000 years, Jews lived as religious communities either in the Middle East or in Europe or wherever they were, because that was the way people lived in those days. In the 19th century, you had the Enlightenment in Europe. The vast majority of Jews come from Europe. And the vast majority of Jews during that century moved from a religious life to a secular life. Sometimes not completely secular. You had Reformed Jews. You had other forms of Judaism as well. Modern Orthodox that left the ultra-Orthodox, became more modern and later became Zionist. But we just have to understand that Zionism was a secular movement. And the vast majority of Jews then, at the turn of the century, and certainly today, are secular. They're not religious. And so the whole idea that somehow these religious laws that the rabbi mentions commit us to certain behavior doesn't really work, either for secular Jews or for what are called the modern Orthodox. I think that's important to understand. And therefore, in the context of the secular nationalist 19th century Europe, especially Eastern and Central Europe, the Jews became, in a sense, imitated their neighbors. So as you had Polish nationalism and Russian nationalism and Hungarian nationalism and so on, Serbian, so you begin to have Jewish nationalism coming here. It makes sense in a way. There was a logic to it, as Ron said, but it had nothing to do with religion. And the Bible was seen again as a more of a secular text. And here, let me get into settler colonialism. So the problem wasn't the Jews came to this country. As the rabbi mentioned, Jews have lived here for thousands of years. Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews from Europe all lived here. There was no problem, and the Palestinians had no problem with Jews living here either. The problem was that when the Zionists decided they're a nation. Okay, you can decide that. It didn't represent all the Jewish people. Zionism represented maybe 3% of the Jewish people at the turn of the 20th century. So it wasn't a huge mass movement. But okay, it was a national movement within Judaism. If they had said 125 years ago, we want to come back to our homeland, we want to revive our national life, our language, and so on, but we recognize and acknowledge as a Palestinian people here. Now, how can we accommodate? That would have been something else. They would have been immigrants coming to integrate into a country. Instead, what they did, and this is the problem, this is the fatal flaw of Zionism, that is that they decided to adopt a settler colonial approach. Rather than coming into the country, immigrating, integrating, recognizing there's a Palestinian people here, an ongoing people that live in this country, they came with the intent of taking it over, of Judaizing the country. And their narrative said, this country belongs to us. There is no other claimant. And therefore, we're going to take all the land. We're going to displace the native population, the Palestinian population, and we're going to Judaize. We're going to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country. We're going to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. So I'll conclude by saying that's the important thing. That the settler colonial approach is what created this inevitable structural conflict between the settlers that want to take over the country and the indigenous population that are resisting. And so the problem we have is that this is a very powerful analysis. I think I've written books about it. There's all kinds of literature. But Israeli Jews themselves don't see themselves as settlers. They don't know, in a way, their history, because what's happened, like Ron says, the way they see it, we're simply another people like all other peoples who came back to our land. We have a state that represents us. What's the problem? And they don't see the structural violence that they did to the Palestinians through settler colonialism. And that's why when Palestinians resist, like in Gaza, for example, or Sheikh Jarrah, it's criminalized. It's seen as terrorism because Israel has cleansed, has decontextualized the political context behind its establishing a Jewish state. All that structural violence is missing, and so the Palestinians turn out to be the criminals. So that's why settler colonialism is such an important part of our discussion.
Thank you for that, Professor Halper. And we just want to get to Professor Greenstein now. And just following up from what Professor Jeff Halper is saying, Professor Greenstein, and where he says that, they don't, the Israeli population and the settlers in particular, don't see themselves as settlers. And just to look at how things have evolved over a period of time, how things have evolved in the last 73 years. We've seen so much land, obviously, being taken away. We see what has happened recently in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, and in Salwan as well. And just to look at, people, obviously, the view is one of entitlement. We are entitled to have all the land in the land of Palestine, now coming against a background. And Rabbi White spoke about Jews that were settled in Europe. We know there was persecution in Europe. We know what had happened during the time of the Holocaust. And now these are people whose grandparents, whose great grandparents were traumatized as a result of the persecution, but coming through into the occupied territories and doing exactly what was done to them many, many years ago.
I think it's important to distinguish between two perspectives within Israeli Jewish society. There is the perspective that regards all of Israel, including the occupied territories, as the inheritance of the Jewish people. And this includes the settlers in the occupied territories. And from their perspective, they are just exercising their rights. Religious right, historical right, nationalist rights. But there is also another trend, and it may be a minority, but a fairly big minority that does make a distinction between the existence of Israel as a Jewish Zionist state and the occupation of 1967. This is the more, you can call it the more liberal Zionist perspective. And from that liberal Zionist perspective, the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state is legitimate, but the occupation, the settlements in the West Bank, the siege on Gaza, the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem, as is happening now in Sheikh Jarrah and other neighborhoods, they are not necessarily legitimate. So these people, who are a minority within Israeli Jewish society, but fairly big minority, I would say about 35-40% of the Jewish population, do reject some aspect of Israeli policies. They, for example, would disagree with you when you talk about an occupation that has lasted for 70 years. From their perspective, the occupation has lasted only 54 years since 1967, and the previous period from 1948 to 1967 was perfectly legitimate in the sense that was an Israel that did not exercise military rule. Perspective is misleading because the foundational act of the State of Israel in 1948 was the ethnic cleansing of the majority of the Palestinian population, what is known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, which is the seminal event in the formation of the State of Israel. But from the perspective of most Israeli Jews, as Jeff Halper said, that was a legitimate act, and they don't regard this as an act of settlement that is illegitimate, unjust. Now, with regard to the 1967 occupation, there are different perspectives. With regard to the 1948 establishment of the State of Israel, these different perspectives are not pronounced. Just a very small minority, secular minority, perhaps also a small religious minority, reject the legitimacy of the State of Israel itself as it was established in 1948. And it's important to realize this is not just the perspective of Israeli Jews. The majority of the international community, which includes also the majority of the Arab and Islamic worlds, as expressed in them being represented by different states, do accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel itself, even though they reject the legitimacy of the occupation. So the big question is how you link these two acts of dispossession, the 1948 Nakba, an establishment of the state of Israel, and the 1967 occupation. From one perspective, they're all part of the same colonial settlement process. But from another perspective, if you talk about legal international legitimacy, there are different acts. Because Israel, whether we like it or not, does have international legitimacy as a state. The occupation itself of 1967 is not legitimate. And that has important implications as to how you organize the struggle against the occupation and against various other oppressive acts enacted by the state of Israel. This continuum that we may see, if you are an anti-Zionist, you will see this continuum, it's part of the same process, is not obvious to everyone. And therefore, it's a political task to make this link between different stages, different manifestation of this settlement process.
Yes. Thank you for that. We're going to go for a quick break, gentlemen. So if you could just hold on, we'll be back in a few minutes.
It's a new era. Salaamedia, humanitarian journalism.
Penny Appeal Love Palestine campaign. Let us stand in solidarity and create an awareness of the plight of the people of Palestine. Support our initiative in providing medical assistance and food security. Donate towards our urgent appeal with your zakat, sadaqah, or lillah. Visit our website www.pennyappeal.org.za or call 031 1100 573. Penny Appeal Love Palestine. Penny Appeal. Small change, big difference.
The Al Shazia Weekend Winter Sale now on. 20% off all ladies and girls abayas, 15% off all plain and branded abayas, 20% off all Samira kaftans, 20% off selected kurtas. Warm up to our sizzling specials this winter. 3 days only, 11, 12 and 13 June. Al Shazia, the scarf specialist. 215 Sparks Road, Overport, Durban. Call 031 207 6462. Al Shazia.
Dad, well, I've been chatting with an investment broker today and...
Broker? Did the broker tell you that our economy is a mess? There's bushfires in Australia, America wanted World War III, and now the coronavirus is traveling around the world.
Well, I also thought about purchasing some crypto.
Crypto? What's that, like another pyramid scheme? I don't trust what I can't see.
There's an apartment in Belito.
So all your family will be asking to stay there for free. And what if the government takes it away, eh?
Dad, I don't think it works like that.
I tell you what works. Gold. At your age, I invested in gold coins and it paid for your university fees and your wedding. No contracts, no agreements. Your investment is in your hands and you own it. With a 70% growth in only 5 years, do you still doubt gold investment? Contact RJ Coin today, 031 202 4701, or visit them at 151 Stephen Lamini Road in Musgrave, Durban. Randery Jewelers Gold Coin Exchange, your passport to gold investment.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to Salaamedia.
The time is just gone 7:45, and if you have just tuned in, we are coming to you on the various platforms of Salaamedia this evening on Wednesday nights with Inayat Wadi, and we're also coming to you live on the Salaamedia Facebook page. We're also coming to you live on Facebook as well, so you can view the interview. We have got Professor Jeff Halper from out of Israel. We've got Rabbi David Weiss, and we also got Professor Ron Greenstein, who are with us this evening. Now, just to get through to Rabbi Weiss, and I've got basically a question that has come through already, and I'm going to obviously ask this one to you because I think this is related relates to you, where it says the Israelis are behaving like Pharaoh and his people. How can they justify their behavior from a religious view? And in the same light, the question that I was going to raise with you was the political class, the political elite in Israel. Just your thoughts in terms of why we're looking at what this listener is saying in terms of justifying the behavior from a religious perspective as well.
Okay, again, with the help of the Almighty, I just before that, I just want to. I was in the middle of just addressing the point about how much percentage-wise of how many Jews are there, but I just wanted also to point out that around the world, we have. Again, if you go to invariably wherever you'll find a very religious community. I'm living in New York, right across from Manhattan is Brooklyn, New York, Williamsburg, Brooklyn. There's a bridge that goes across from Manhattan. It's called Williamsburg Bridge, and we have. It's the largest concentration of religious Jews outside of Jerusalem. And there's not one single Israeli flag in our neighborhoods. We have literally hundreds of thousands of Jews who come out. There's who come out and demonstrate in front of the White House, and with the constantly being other people mentioning that or the other people on the panel, not that they want to disparage us. I see it; they're very respectful and I appreciate it, but they seem to not recognize that the core of Judaism around the world and the core of the Jewish people are the ones that are upholding, which is logical, what religion was about for this 3,000 years. And you have around the world, whether it's in Washington D.C., whether it's in Canada or in London or in England, wherever you will go, the very religious community stands very strongly in their opposition to a creation of a state, because it's simply antithetical. It's diametrically opposite. It's contradictory. Judaism is to serve God. Occupation is, as the distinguished guests say, they were all saying that it's a nationalism. It's a fact. Now, being that there's a lot of people who may be supporting it, yes, there's a lot. Unfortunately, it's true. Once around 200 odd years ago, 250 years ago, when Reform Judaism started, and the majority of Jews dropped their religion. That's fine. That's not fine. It's terrible. It's a tragedy. But they come in, and then they can call this their right, which they traipse around the world with their chief rabbis and with their statements that they have the right to the land. And psychologically, when they go to the United Nations, their prime minister, whenever, it's always built, predicated on that God gave us the right to the land. It was ours. It's not only gave us the right, but it was ours. They waived the Torah as a deed. And that's what their claim is. And the nations that support them, here in the United States, the evangelistic Christians and so forth, the millions of people that support them, is because of the claim that they're the children of Israel, that's their land, and that gives them the right. And if the world would understand that they're being conned and duped, then the whole they would address this whole conflict. This whole it's not a conflict; it's a major crime. They would this quagmire. They would look at it in a different light, but they look at it as a conflict between two religions, and we have to get out somehow to be able to solve this way of two people being able to live together in peace, when both of them have a legitimate claim here. But if they would just go, some people would come from China, some people would come from another religion, and let's just take Islam and come and take over Rhode Island or do something like that. The United States would never, even if it would be 1 centimeter, 1 inch of the United States would be taken over by another people. The whole United States would stand up. I'm not coming to condone violence, but the fact is nobody would accept it in the United States. This is just, it's totally criminal. It's outrageous. It cannot be done, and that is what the issue here is constantly. And the Prime Minister Netanyahu was constantly stressing that it should be referred to as a Jewish state, because he understood what he's doing. He wants to psychologically have this advantage that if anybody speaks up against them, they can dub them. They can they can be labeled as anti-Semitic, because anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, and that is why it's so critical to understand what the difference is. And when we get into that, again, I keep on saying that we have many people who simply didn't drop their religion, and they're there and they're living in the Holy Land, or they're living in other parts of the world, certainly. And here you have every boy or girl who turns 17 in the Holy Land, who's religious, who refuses to serve in the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, where there is mandatory military service. They're a criminal, and they get arrested simply because they're refusing to serve in the army. They get harassed, they get arrested, they get beaten on the streets. Old rabbis. In fact, today, I don't. I'm sure the historians, Jeff and Ron, the historians, they know that there was Dr. Yaakov Yisrael Dahan, who was a very maybe the first famous martyr who was assassinated in 1924 by the Zionists. He lived in Holland. He came over to the Holy Land because he thought to be a good Jew meant to be a supporter of Zionism, and he was a brilliant person. He was a distinguished diplomat. The king of there's statues of him in Holland. The king of Denmark, I believe, escorted him, or they escorted him when he left the country there and came to the Holy Land. He right away dropped Zionism when he became acquainted with the chief rabbi of Palestine, who was Rabbi Sonnenfeld at the time, and he stood in total opposition to Zionism, and they warned him they're going to kill him, and they assassinated him. But this is what's being done. It's unbelievable. There's no pictures showing this. It's a blank in the news that old men, old rabbis, women, children, babies, they get beaten, they get harassed, they get arrested. This is an ongoing. They're being sprayed with chemicals. They're being sprayed with stink gas. We have thousands and thousands of pictures that's happening for over 70 years, and can never be accused of being militant. We don't carry arms. We don't have one, never could be accused of carrying a gun, yet they get brutally attacked and assassinated. This is the fact of around the world. So if you take this into the perspective of what the situation here, the world is being intimidated into supporting Zionism, and when they try to not support it or speak up, here in the United States, they're going against Jews, and we've been taken off Facebook because we wrote in the word anti-Zionism. We don't call for militancy, and yet they took us off Facebook and YouTube and many other. Our sites have been closed, and the world doesn't get to see what's the fact on the ground, and that we don't have a religious conflict, and that Jews are standing together with Palestinians, crying and suffering and hurting, and we are abashed, we are humiliated, and we are frustrated that our voice is not heard. We stand in front of the United Nations weekly. We have people standing there. We have tens of thousands of Jews, at least through the month, that stands and demonstrates here and in the Holy Land, in different places in occupied Palestine. And in occupied Palestine, there's neighborhoods that have Palestinian flags painted on their walls in Mea Shearim, where the core, I mentioned New York, but in Mea Shearim, and the core of the religious community that was there before the Zionists came, their community is totally anti-Zionist. And yet the world doesn't even appreciate that the more the religious, the more anti-Zionist. And that the core issue here has to be the fact that the Jewish religion is being used as the hammer to oppress the Palestinian people, and to stifle any opposition around the world. And it's definitely part and parcel of why the United States stands in support, because human rights, they feel hurt, the Jewish people suffered in the Holocaust and so forth. Well, in fact, the Zionists are perpetrating this Nakba, almost a genocide now, or the beginning of a genocide, what they're doing, and it's being done as because the world is silent, because they pity the Jews. And this is all wrong. If to pity the Jews would be to eliminate this impediment to peace, the cause of the bloodshed of Palestinian people and Jewish people who are being daily murdered and oppressed there, and that has created a exacerbation of anti-Semitism around the world. It used to be that Muslim and Jews got along and I'm not saying was it perfect, but relatively, and we always got along, and relatively compared to other religions, we were able to coexist, and many times it was superb. The religion wasn't an impediment. It has nothing to do with the religious conflict. And Zionism has created a mistrust of Jews and has driven a rift between Jews and Muslims, both in Palestine and around the world. And the suffering of the Palestinians is being stifled. People are afraid to speak up for them because they're labeled anti-Semitic. So this is, people ask why. The one who asked the question now asked why, how could this happen and all that. It's because these people don't have the morals of God, and they're stifling the voice and the courage of the Jewish people who are standing up in Palestine daily against them, and there is no justification for it. There's no justification. The claim to differentiate between 67 and 48 is ridiculous. I mean, as the esteemed scholars here were saying, they said, I mean, really, it doesn't make any sense. Why is 67 something that we should stand against? Because it was more televisions to show that it's wrong, and in 48, where they enjoy the mic to themselves, the Zionists, so they're able to take over a land. How could they if the United Nations should ratify a Jewish state? Would they ratify a Muslim state or a Buddhist state to take over the United States? How dare they ratify a country that they call themselves a Jewish state, and that they should erase the majority of people who are the Muslims, and the second majority were the Christians, and it was the Jewish, and the Zionist state erases all their rights. I mean, it's beyond belief, and it doesn't make sense. It's only, we say it's the works of Satan, because it's absolutely against the logic that they could ratify to make such a state, and besides which, it's contradictory in and of itself. Is it a Jewish state or a democracy? I mean, I speak to distinguished people from, I can't mention their names, from BBS and from major newspapers. They said the reason why Zionism never can go into a debate on these issues, and they simply intimidate and scare and yell anti-Semitism, is because it just totally lacks logic. Is it a democracy or is it a Jewish state? Or what's happening here? Anyway, and as a Jewish state, it's simply a farce. It's not a Jewish state, and we can live together in peace. We have been living together for hundreds and hundreds of years, and these are the indigenous populace of the area of the Holy Land. So how dare a group of people come and claim, because they have large numbers, or what it may be, or just they're enjoying the media attention, that how dare they speak in our name? And just one more point, that they're using the settlers, where you see religious Jews and so forth, and they're rabbinate and settlers, because they're always in the news. You'd think that there's a large number of these, but in truth, this is an aberration. The settlers, almost in its entirety, are idealists that come from non-religious families, or some of them who just moved into the Mizrahi, like who's incorporating the religion to give themselves that identity, that legitimacy of taking the land. But in the core religious communities, it's simply it's a fact that it's just incongruous. It's impossible to that these two issues should be able to coexist. Zionism is a total disenfranchisement from Judaism. You can't steal from a people and kill and go against the words of the Torah and yet claim it's a Jewish state. So it's all wrong, and it's lacking simple in the knowledge around the world and in the education, and that's why we have to work. It's so critical, this program and others, to be able to breach the walls of the mainstream media that's under intimidation or ownership, or under intimidation of Zionist media control.
Thank you for that, Rabbi. And Professor Halper, just to bring you into the discussion now, obviously, we're looking at issues like race, we're looking at like ethnicity, we're looking at the question of class. Now, we know historically that many Jews obviously struggled to achieve what we call social justice and to stand up against injustice and oppression. And many are saying, not in our name. And this is the reason why we see that many are compelled at this point in time to speak out, considering, their identity. But there are many, we know, in South Africa that were against apartheid, in the struggle against apartheid. And obviously, they've been through this journey, and they see this journey unfolding in a place like Israel. And just to get your thoughts on on speaking out against what is happening as we speak right now in Israel.
Well, what is true is that Zionism and Israel today have co-opted Judaism. In other words, what the rabbi is saying, we should be saying "not in my name," is true. Because Israel claims to be a Jewish state, but in fact, what it did, in my view at least, is that it took a Judaism, that's a religion, a culture, a people, ancient histories all over the world, very diverse, and it shoved all of that into a nationalistic framework, so that Judaism became a national religion, and it lost by any national religion. Anytime you put nationalism and religion together, you lose everything humanistic, everything, all the values, certainly cosmopolitanness, social justice. In other words, all of that becomes subservient to the nation. And so what you have today are really, there's a lot of Jewish diversity, but let's say at large, two big, very different Jewish populations. And first of all, you have in Israel, Israeli Jews, who again are national Jews. Their Judaism comes from the Torah, from the first 5 books of Moses and the book of Joshua, the book of conquest. Now, the rabbi might think his concept of God might be compassionate. You look at those books, man, and God is not compassionate. God says to Moses, to Joshua, to all the different conquerors, Saul and David and everybody else, you kill everybody, all the Canaanites. And if we think of Canaanites maybe as ancient Palestinians, there's a fairly long Jewish history for killing Palestinians. It was those are genocidal books. The first 5 books of the Bible and Joshua are genocidal books. Read the book of Joshua sometime. And that became the basis of Zionism, because every settler colonial movement, you had the same thing in South Africa. Every settler colonial movement has to make up a story about why this country that we're coming to conquer belongs actually to us, and it doesn't belong to the indigenous population. Well, Zionists had a ready-made narrative. God gave us this land. Whoa, that's pretty authoritative. And God says you should conquer the land, and it's your land, and it's exclusively your land. So that the Bible really gave Zionist nationalism, and then it took the nationalism of Eastern Europe as well. When you put that together, that became a pretty deadly combination. And that's the Israeli Judaism we have here. Jews abroad, in the United States, I would say in South Africa to a certain degree, certainly in Europe as well, they take their Judaism from somewhere else, not from the Bible. They take, from the Bible, but from the prophets. In other words, Jews abroad overwhelmingly, certainly American and Canadian Jews, are motivated by social justice. Even in South Africa, tell me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember that in Mandela's first government, there were 5 white ministers and they were all Jews. I don't know if that's true, but Jews were very prominent in the anti-apartheid movement, in the civil rights movement in the U.S., in the anti-war movements, in the human rights movements. René Cassin, who was a French jurist, was the author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's what defines Jews abroad: social justice, human rights, a cosmopolitan point of view, and a secular point of view, actually, for the most part. So that they're going, so they can't relate to Israel. They can't relate to the nationalism, the co-opting of Judaism as a conquest, as a tool of oppression. And that's why you're getting more and more a split. And Israel is losing the Jewish populations abroad that see that Israel cannot speak in our name. The problem is, of course, that for Israel, it's very useful. It's very useful to do that blurring, because they can use the Jews abroad. They instrumentalize the Jews abroad. It can use them as lobbyists for its own policies. So when Netanyahu gets up and says, this is a Jewish state and I invaded Gaza in the name of the Jewish people, see, if the Jews don't get up abroad and say, not in my name, you do not represent us, then they're complicit in keeping this blurring. That's why you're having anti-Semitic attacks in New York, because the Jews are complicit in the blurring between themselves and Israel. You go into a synagogue, not Rabbi Weiss's synagogue, but most synagogues, and you'll see the American flag on one side of the rabbi and an Israeli flag on the other side of the rabbi. So that blurring. So American Jews have to, and Jews abroad have to get up and say, not in my name. And I think that's happening more and more. The Israeli ambassador to the U.S., the last one, Ron Dermer, said about a week ago, Israel has lost American Jews. The only ones we have left in America are evangelicals. So that I think that division that's happening is something, and there's two different Jewish peoples beginning to emerge. There's one Israeli people, a Jewish nationalist group that's involved with national projects of occupation and settler colonialism and state building. And there's all the Jews abroad who are certainly much more concerned with integrating into their countries and being progressive voices for social justice.
Yes, Professor Ren Greenstein, just following up from Professor Jeff Helper with regard to the Jewish identity and the question of identity, and talking about Jews abroad versus Jews in Israel. Do you concur, obviously, with what he's saying, and just your thoughts again and your views on, or just expanding in terms of what Professor Jeff Helper is saying as far as Jews abroad are concerned, particularly in the light of what is happening in Israel, but also in terms of a movement that is growing, that is standing up to the brutal oppression that we see, or that we've seen over a period of time.
Yeah, I agree fully with what Jeff is saying. I just want to add 2 points just to amplify his perspective. First, it's true that the majority of Jews, especially in North America, do not identify themselves with Israeli policies. But that is not the case for the elites, the political, the financial elites among them, because the official, so-called official Jewish leadership in the United States, in South Africa, in the UK, and many other countries do align themselves with the state of Israel and with the Israeli government, not just with the state in general, but with the specific policy of the Israeli government, at least in the sense that they will never criticize them in public. That's what's happening with the South African official Jewish community. I want to make a distinction between the official representative, the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, for example, in South Africa, or similar organizations in the United States and the United Kingdom, which are still aligned with the state of Israel and the government of Israel, and the majority of ordinary Jews who adopt a more critical perspective. So that's one distinction, and it's important to keep it in mind, because these organizations claim to be speaking for the community as a whole, and that's not the case. Another dimension is that we also have to take into consideration the dimension of age, because public opinion surveys show that there is a clear distinction between younger people and older people, at least in the United States, which is the biggest Jewish community in the world, but also the most studies. They show that the younger you are, in simple terms, the more critical you become, because you look at the issues from the perspective of other young people who are concerned with social justice in their own societies and in the world at large. So it's kind of a natural progression. Of course, it may take many years until these young people become the majority of the community, but that's a hopeful sign, because the younger, the better educated, the more progressive people become, the more critical they are of their official community and of the state of Israel and its policies. So these are hopeful signs, but it doesn't mean that we can take it for granted, because you need an ongoing educational campaigns, political campaign, mobilization around these issues of social justice. And the key to it is to make clear that the Palestinian issues, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or relationship, are just one aspect of the global social justice movement. It's not something that you can set it apart. We must integrate, and that's happening all the time, but it must be pushed forward further. We must integrate the Palestinian issue within this context of the struggle for social justice, which is led by younger people, but should be a broader concern for the community as a whole. So things are changing, but there's still a long way to go.
Yes. Now, Rabbi Weiss, just looking at two other concepts I'd like to talk about, one being rights and the other being power. Now, these two are obviously interrelated. And, when a person says, I have a right to something, and then he is backed by a power, like, for instance, we've seen, and we have been talking about the political class, and Professor Greenstein has referred to as the elite as well, where you have strong lobby groups who firmly believe that it is their right, and as a result of that right, they can exercise their power in any way whatsoever, including perpetrating acts of injustices against a group of people.
Yes. Well, first I have to take umbrage. I have to again, not that I'm attacking. I know Jeff didn't. I doubt he went to yeshiva, which is a religious education. So I'm not blaming him in any manner, and that's what I'm saying. That's one of the core problems, that Zionism took advantage of the fact that people don't know the religion, the truth of the religion. So, like, to claim that God isn't, God forbid, is not compassionate, and that God and sent Moses, and that they should commit crimes against humanity. I mean, it's not. This is not the place and the time for this discussion about God's compassion or how God rules His world, and so forth. But anybody who does study the Torah understands that we call him that God is the Almighty and the compassionate, and the Muslims know, also understand this, and understand that's why they never had a problem with the Jewish people either, because although we were extremely religious, fervently religious Jews, they never had a problem with us, because they understood that we're following the Torah, and that and there's nothing to fear of God's compassion. It happened to be when Joshua went into the land, anybody who would not worship, who accepted not to worship idols, were allowed to remain there. And it's a whole other discussion of how it was, and that they, when they walked around the walls of Jericho, and the walls of Jericho sunk in, it was it was totally through the Almighty. It was miraculous happening. So it's not fair. But but what does belong here is how the con game, and how the Zionists took exactly what Jeff was saying, that the Zionists took the Torah, and they found a beautiful way for themselves to take that as a deed and a right to steal the land from the Palestinian people. Even though, if anybody does go to the scholars who studies the Torah the way it's given to us from generation to generation, it's a basic ABC of the Torah, that since 2,000 years ago, even though we suffered so much, we never, as in the responses of the Rambam, Maimonides, and all the great leaders, that we are, when Jews asked them, it was suffering so much, couldn't we build ourselves a little state? There was the golden age of Judaism. They could have easily created their own little land sovereignty, or whatever it may be, even a large land. Yet the rabbis come and said, have patience. God is compassionate. He sees your suffering. We are forbidden to create a Jewish sovereignty. When the time will come, the Almighty will end the exile. We're all, like it says in our verses, again, it's the Torah verses from God, where it says all the nations will join together and serve God. Not everybody will become Jewish, but they will all recognize one God and serve in peace, and God will rebuild a temple. That's why we were never a threat, because our belief is not a threat to any other nation. We may have totally different beliefs about the future, what it will be between Muslims, but it's an issue of how God will end the world, the future, how it will develop this world. So we will never threaten. The Torah should never be taken in as what the Zionists are doing. It's not what Jeff is doing. It's what the Zionists are using, abusing the Torah and using that, and then it turns out that God turns out to be a terrible, it was like a God, I don't want to use the words on God, but like a monster, the way they want to portray it. And it's a simple lack of knowledge of the Torah, and not everything from the Torah we understand, but that's definitely no connection whatsoever to Zionism. I carry around a picture, for instance, this is the David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, reading the Declaration of Independence in 1948 in Independence Hall, with the Star of David, obviously, and you can see all the leaders. Now, if you would have a Muslim country, you would see some imam or somebody, a sheikh or an ayatollah or somebody of religious value. Here, and nobody's even covering their heads, which is a requirement of Judaism. It's just a farce. It's not a Jewish state. They're simply using that Judaism to and the Bible and all of that to get the evangelistic Christians and so forth to be able to get that support. If that would not be there, there would be no justification whatsoever around the world for the support of what is happening in Gaza, in Sheikh Jarrah, or in the occupation of Palestine. That is why it's so critical to harp and speak about constantly that there is abuse and a falsification of the use of Judaism here, and that is not an excuse or a reason for them to be able to hold the rights to the land. And as was mentioned earlier, we did live together for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, or more, it's even thousands of years. But even since Islam was created, we've been living together in the streets of Jerusalem in harmony. I have many pictures, just beautiful pictures of how Jews and Arabs live together. So that has to be really reiterated. And I want to just mention that the Zionists, when he has, let's say, Jabotinsky, we have a book called The Traditional Torah Opposition to Zionism, Historical Documents. This is one of many books that we have, but some of them have documents from the Zionists. And Jabotinsky was the founder of Visionist Zionism, wrote unabashedly in a newspaper, Haaretz newspaper, October 1919. This is 1919. This is way back then, and they were not embarrassed to state. He wrote, "In the national home, we will announce that those Jews who have on themselves the rust of exile and refuse to shave off their beards and pay us earlocks will be second-class citizens and will not have the right to vote." Imagine, they're making a Jewish state, and you think a Nazi said this. I wouldn't say who said it, you think it's a Nazi. Or Theodor Herzl wrote in his diary, he said, "The way to solve the problem of anti-Semitism is to speak to the head priest of Vienna to get an appointment with the Pope to make a mass conversion of all the Jews of Austria to Catholicism. It should be done on a Sunday in the middle of the day with music and pride publicly. We are the last generation that held on to the faith of our forefathers. The conversion will be in St. Stephen's Cathedral." This is in his own diary. So, I mean, you're just looking at the farce of what they are and how they have of the religious Jews and of the Palestinian people. And that's what has to be really, this issue has to be on the forefront of any opposition to Zionism, so to give people the space when they want to speak about their opposition to the oppression of the Palestinians, that they shouldn't be attacked as anti-Semitic, but they have to be careful not to call it a Jewish state or so forth. And I just want to add just one more point on that. When the first president was Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the president of Israel, and in the 1930s, when Jews were starting to be murdered by the Nazis, he had a meeting, and this is quoted in Jewish press, October 1802, where he wrote, Palestine, this is a meeting that's quoted many times, "Palestine," he said, "cannot absorb the Jews of Europe. We want only the best of Jewish youth to come to us. We want only the educated to enter Palestine for the purpose of increasing its culture. The other Jews will have to stay where they are and face whatever fate awaits them. These millions of Jews are dust on the wheels of history and may have to be blown away. We don't want them pouring into Palestine. We don't want Tel Aviv to become another low-grade ghetto." This is their hate for the religious Jews and these really hundreds of thousands of Jews around the world who stand in the most vehement opposition to the existence of this state of Israel, and they're there. They're there in the United States. It's true what both Ron and Jeff was saying, that you have Ron was mentioning that it's the elite. They have this. They have what would you call? They have the lobby, the Zionist lobby, where they really have the chokehold on any voices that dare to speak up against Zionism. That because right away they're labeled anti-Semitic. They have the Jewish lobby, they have the UJA, they have all the different names of their different power sources, and that is why you can't have a proper discussion, or you can't have the proper hear the voice of Judaism, and Jews are being vilified instead of saying that it's it happens to be an aberration, something that's wrong, that just started some 70 odd years or 100 odd years ago, and it's a flawed, selfish political movement that doesn't hold water. It should not be allowed. It has to be stopped. Instead of that, they're trying to fuse this together, incorporate it with the religion of 3,000 years, and then you get a problem. How do you separate the two? How could you live peacefully? You can't eradicate Judaism. You can't eradicate the Muslim Islam or so forth. So you have a serious problem. But it's not a serious problem. The serious problem is the power of the Zionist lobby and these political heads. And that's why we have to tackle that, whether it be in South Africa or around the world. This is the way to be able to, and it's lacking in the leadership to grab it by the snake by its head, and to understand how to undermine the power of Zionism by revealing to the world the falseness of what it is, the duplicity and so forth.
Is the moderator there? Because we can't see him.
I think we lost the moderator.
Yeah, we have problems with electricity in South Africa, so I think that may be the cause of that, because it went dark and then disappeared completely.
Well, that's what they're trying to
so
do.
let me begin the negotiations.
I say that's what they're trying to do with the voice, the opposition to Zionism. We go out in demonstrations of tens of thousands, and we say, "What's happening? Why isn't this being covered?" Everything. It's always like that for many years. So,
if the moderator is gone, is this still broadcasting?
I really don't know.
All right. Well, maybe we should just call it a night, huh?
Yeah, I think so, because it's not clear whether it's still going ahead. So,
all right, Ron, it was good to meet you. I've read your stuff for years, but we've never really met.
We met in the Russell Tribunal in Cape Town.
That's right. In
but
Cape
you
Town.
may not remember, I took a course with you like 40 years ago. At Haifa University. It was about ethnic groups in Israel or Jerusalem.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, it's great to see you again.
I'll tell you a third place.
Great to meet you, Rabbi Weiss.
Yeah, I'd like to mention to you a third place. We met. We believe that every Jewish soul was on Mount Sinai, made this covenant to keep, just like God created the world 6 days, and with the 7th He rested. We have to keep the Shabbos. So I'm appealing to you to keep the Shabbos and stand against Zionists. That's all part and parcel of what Judaism is. He gave us our souls. He gives us our life. We have to keep the Sabbath. And
all right. Well, I'm willing to stand against Zionism, and I keep the Sabbath in my own way.
You will.
Okay. All right.
All right. Anyway, thank you all for tuning in. I think we're still broadcasting, actually. I think we managed to hit some important issues. It was a good discussion. It lasted more than an hour, so we're going to take the prerogative of calling it a night. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Which one? Is it going disconnected? Right? I mean, yeah, was I mit 355. Ich meine, es going disconnected, nicht ich. Die Tine going nicht ich mein.
Number you have entered is invalid.
Okay, South Africa. Comes into South Africa. Where's the number? Disconnect gewoon is wel. Ich kenne sein, ich bin noch connected. Ich meine, so ist nicht disconnect. 631634026. Okay.
The number you have entered is invalid. Please try again.
Hello.
Well, the time is just gone 8:33 p.m. and we must apologize for that. And these are issues that are out of our hands, and we are definitely not in Gaza. But the power, unfortunately, has gone, and the dreaded load shedding had basically kicked in as we were in the middle of the discussion. And we still are going to get our guests back. We're going to get Professor Jeff Halper back, Professor Ron Greenstein, and also Reba Wise. We're going to get back, and I see Reba Wise is back with us. Rabbi, we need to apologize for that. We have got a huge problem with power in the country, and it is called load shedding. So every now and then we are without electricity, and that's why I mentioned we're not in Gaza right now. We are in South Africa, but we definitely will try and get our guests back as well. And have got quite a bit to obviously still talk about. And I know you were in the middle of the discussion and the question
Yes.
I had obviously raised with you with regards to rights and power. And just while we are waiting for the other guests to join us, to look at the political class, to look at the ruling class. And we've seen over the years, we've seen people like Ariel Sharon, we've seen Netanyahu, who has had this marathon spell as the prime minister of Israel. And now we're talking about Bennett, obviously, who is in power. And just your thoughts on the leadership, on the political leadership in Israel at the moment.
Yeah, so with the help of the Almighty, I don't know where I got cut off, but it's really like I was trying to explain. The Zionism is using, like even Jeff was saying, that's really it hurts to hear it even. But you see, when they try to say, you see, they have a finished packaged story to be able to take over the land by claiming this is what the Bible was about and God was about. And as I was saying, that God is compassionate. The Muslim people in that religion, they always speak about Mahurach. God is about Racham. We say it was very similar. God is compassionate, and to claim that God forbid, it's just I don't even like to repeat these things like that. God forbid, that's lacking in God's compassion, or that and God sent to Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, and that to do something that was incompassionate. That's part of the Nakba of this catastrophe, is that they're taking God and the Torah and claiming that that's what gives them the right to do it to the Palestinian people, and they can do, and nobody should complain when they oppress a people because they're doing it in the name of God. And this is just revolting and repulsive. And like I say, it's lacking in the knowledge of the Torah. If somebody would study in the Torah, they would see that it was clear that God said anybody did have a right to stay if they wanted to not worship idol worship. They were able to stay in the land, and the walls of Jericho and all that, the way they entered Palestine, the Holy Land of Jericho, was that the walls sunk, and this was all totally something from God of miracles. And it was, and really, I don't want to get into because this is not the forum to get into to speaking about the holiness of the Torah, compassion of God, and so forth. But to incorporate what the Zionists are doing with Judaism is part of that terrible crime, what they're doing to the Palestinian people, and the way they're beating and oppressing the Jewish people and assassinated our rabbis. As I mentioned earlier, today is the day to commemorate the anniversary of what they assassinated, in the Jewish anniversary of when they assassinated Dr. Dahan, because in 1924, maybe the first famous martyr, because he said he's going to go to British Parliament, he's going to inform the Britain that what they're doing is they simply dupe them, and that the Jewish community does not want this occupation, does not want a Jewish state, and that it's not acceptable. But they looked at him as such a threat, the Zionists, that they informed him they threatened him, and and they bragged about it. They shot him cold-bloodedly in front of Shaare Zedek Hospital in Jerusalem. So the concept of using the Torah or God or the Jewishness to justify what Zionism is, that is a core part of the catastrophe, and has totally nothing to do. The Torah is compassionate, and as Muslims and Jews, we live together in total harmony with a distinctly different religion, and we were not deemed a threat one to the other, because it's truth. We're practicing our religion. On the contrary, the Muslim people respected our rabbis, and we were always like a sample of godliness. And like God tells us in our Torah, it says that you should be a light unto the nations, that we have to be somebody to look at as a sample of what it means to be holy, of being compassionate. And just as compassionate, which says in our teachings, Mahu Racham, Afatute Racham, you have to be compassionate. We have to emulate God. We tell our children, when they go to a store, the little boy, and he wants to take a little candy from the store, we said, you're not allowed to do it. God forbids it. You're not allowed to steal a penny. You're not allowed to steal. And that's how we train our children. It's total compassion. This is all wrong. Now, Zionism is a pure nationalism. I was showing you that they go with their heads uncovered. This is the farce of it, and they're claiming to speak a Jewish state. How audacious, how the hubris, the illegality of this, to take a religion, and because it's convenient for them, and that will give them the backing that they need from the world, that they take a religion away from a people who died in Auschwitz, who died throughout the generations for our religion, and to use that to because for their selfishness, because they want to create their own political sovereignty. This is unacceptable and what people would call inhumane, and it's ungodly. What we call ungodly, what people call humanity. So that we're very strong about.
But just coming back, Rabbi Weiss, I just wanted your thoughts on the leadership. And how do you see the leadership, people like, as I mentioned, Sharon in the past, Netanyahu, and now Bennett?
Well, you see, that's the Jewish outlook with God's help from our communities. We look at the state of Israel as a den of thieves. It's a criminal undertaking. It's a criminal entity, and therefore sometimes you'll have one criminal who's worse than the other. Sometimes one who's more right or more left leaning or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's what with all respect and nothing against the Italian people, whatever, you have the mafia. So you'd say, well, this guy's leading the mafia now. He's much nicer than the guy who was there beforehand. I mean, the question is who's presenting, wearing more perfume, who's presenting himself nicer to the world. But they're leading an entity that in every minute of its existence is a rebellion against God by the fact that they're stealing, oppressing, and stealing the land from a people. It's simply
I see Rabbi. Sorry, Rabbi, I see Professor Jeff Halper has joined us as well. Professor Halper, really, we need to apologize. As I mentioned, we're not living in Gaza. The power has gone in South Africa, and we must apologize for obviously having cut off for a while. But the question I was raising with Rabbi Weiss was the leadership, and just your thoughts on the leadership in Israel at this point in time. And we've seen how leadership has evolved over a period of time. Sharon, even before Sharon, and then we've seen this marathon stint as prime minister by Benjamin Netanyahu, and now we're talking about Naftali Bennett. Just your thoughts on the leadership.
Well, in my view, Israeli Jews are caught in this settler colonial framework. It has its own logic to it, and they're not aware of it. They think they're living a normal life and so on. But, again, the basis of settler colonialism is displacing an indigenous people. So the violence and the conflict and the antagonism is built in. It's structural. It's part of the system. It's part of the logic, you see. Now people aren't aware of that. Most people aren't academics. Most people don't have theories and read books about this stuff. So they just live their lives. They're normal people just living their lives. But they're living the logic. So for Israelis, you see, they're in a permanent conflict, a permanent state of oppression and occupation and repression and violence against the Palestinian people, because the Palestinian people can never accept oppression and occupation and apartheid and settler colonialism as normal. They have to resist. But Israelis, because they're living a normal life, for most people, this is normal. Just as normal as living in Cape Town. We go to coffee shops, nobody sees Arabs, we have our TV programs, everything is normal here. And so they don't understand why the Palestinians are fighting us. The only explanation most people have if they don't have theory and they don't have a political context, is they must hate us. It's built into Islam, it's built into Arabs that they hate us, and they've always hated us, and so you get that whole story, which is true. And so all we can do is fight them because they're criminals, they're terrorists. In other words, it's not political. For Israelis, there's no political issue here because we wanted to negotiate. Now, Israelis don't know if the negotiations were sincere or not. They weren't sincere. We never negotiated really with Palestinians, but most people don't know that stuff. They don't always read the newspapers. They're not so sophisticated, most people. And they simply accept what everybody thinks. And so the idea is, we tried to make peace. The Arabs didn't want it. They did intifadas. They're terrorists. We want peace, and they're attacking us. Look at Gaza, so they don't see the context. They don't see it. They don't know that there's a siege of Gaza for the last 15 years. No one's really told them that. That's not so all they see is one day I'm having coffee and here comes a rocket from Gaza. And that's the problem we have with Israelis. And that is that they just don't get it. They don't see the political context of colonialism, of foundational violence, of oppression, of displacement, of taking of land. They don't see any of that stuff. All they see is they're living a normal life like anybody else. And here people are attacking us. So in a sense, I think what that means, and of course the leaders are the same thing. I don't think the leaders are a little more sophisticated, but they also, in a sense, buy into that paradigm. So basically what I think the bottom line is, for those of us that want a just peace, that want one democratic state, which the only way out of settler colonialism is to decolonize. There's no compromise that's possible. And in decolonization, you want to establish a democratic state over all of historic Palestine that includes everybody living here as equal, and the refugees, of course, return. So the only way we're going to get there is that the Palestinians lead an international struggle against Israeli apartheid, very much like the ANC. And just like the most whites in South Africa were not partners in dismantling apartheid, so Israeli Jews are not going to be partners in dismantling Israeli apartheid. We have to bypass them. We have to neutralize them. We have to create a new political reality, make Israeli apartheid collapse, and then, with no choice, the Israeli Jews will have to go through a transition into a new kind of a state. That's really, so the leadership actually has to come more from the Palestinians, because they have to be the ones that articulate a political program that we, critical Israelis, and anti-Zionist Jews like Rabbi Weiss can join in with. And then you and the international civil society joins with the Palestinians as well. And we create this global movement against Israeli apartheid and for a democratic state. So the leadership in the end is not going to be Netanyahu and Bennett and these guys. The leadership is going to be whatever Palestinian leaders emerge that have this political program and can begin to mobilize all of us with a political end game, which is one democratic state.
Yes, Rabbi Weiss, Professor Jeff Halper just spoke about an international solidarity movement coming from all walks of life, looking at various sectors, whether it's religious, whether we look at civil society, whether we're looking at activism. Your thoughts on the entire movement coming together to put the type of pressure? Do you think that will work?
We're not prophets. What we can say is, and sometimes we thank God we go to many Palestinian pro-Palestinian demonstrations. We speak and we always mention this, that sometimes it looks hopeless. The case looks hopeless. But then you remind yourself that USSR was for 70 years and it was one of the superpowers, and all of a sudden, like basically overnight, what you have in South Africa, in the United Nations, South Africa was given the greatest respect as a member nation, while Nelson Mandela was rotting in prison. He was a criminal, and yet the things turned. So we say always that we believe that the Almighty rules the world, that the first issue is that we have to do what we have to do. First, but we have to remember at the end of the day that the accomplishment will be done by God. And the Torah says, why are you rebelling against me? It will not be successful. The state of Israel will, because what it is, that it is a rebellion against God and its establishment in the many issues, as I mentioned, the many facets, because it steals, it kills, we're not allowed to have a Jewish state. It will end. We don't know how many years it will take. They didn't have 10 years of peace, but that's just a side issue. That could be because it says it will not be successful in the Torah. So they always they thought the 67 war, wow, and this and everything, miracles. And we kept on saying, I'm sorry, you're rebelling against God. This will end. So we urge everybody, first of all, to pray to God for a speedy and peaceful end of this Nakba, of this rebellion against God. At the same time, we urge everybody constantly, and I've been doing this when I was maybe 40 years ago, still we were speaking and urging people that it's a pity that there's a lack of advertisements, of media knowledge, because in the regular mainstream media refuses to speak about the truth of the issue. They have the alternative narrative of Zionism that portrays this as Jeff was saying. They portray this as simply it's because the villains are the villains are the Palestinians. The victims are the Jewish people who just went through the Holocaust, and it's because it's anti-Semitic, and that's why they hate us and so forth. And it's a religious conflict, and that they had a free pass of a free trip for many tens of years, and nobody was there to speak up in opposition. Now we have alternative media. There's a few, maybe Press TV. You have Al Jazeera did it. I don't know that, I don't see it that much there, but you have an alternative media. Maybe your program that will report the truth of how we live together, and the narrative is a false narrative. It was never a religious conflict. We lived together in peace, and it was never an impediment, the difference of religion, to our coexistence. And all of a sudden, a new movement started that came using a legitimate name, a respected name called Judaism, the religion. They're using this as a cover-up to oppress and to steal a land, basically do a total criminal act of stealing and oppressing and taking away a land and colonizing, or how we would like to refer it, to the Palestinian land, including oppressing the indigenous Jews that were there, the Jewish community that was there. And I could just say Dr. Dehan, who I mentioned, was murdered. Before he was assassinated, the Britain insisted that every Jew had to be registered under the Zionists when they came. And imagine that, the Jewish community that was living there for hundreds of years, they insisted that every Jew now has to register under the Zionists. And he was barely able to extract that the ones who didn't want to register don't have to register. But it came with a very complicated and very hard issue, and he was able to do that. And then they assassinated him. But basically, in reality, if the world would be able to take into proper perspective, to be able to see the fact that there were three religions living in the Holy Land, coexisting in harmony, and that all the problem is since the development of a political movement, nothing to do with religion, and that is what the problem is. And the way to simply go back to a history that's a fact on the ground is by removing. It's only a 73-year history of the state. Remove this impediment to peace. Instead of giving them from the United States coffers, giving them how many billions of dollars a year for their arms and so forth, simply end this thing, and there will be peace. And the repercussions in all the other Middle Eastern countries and around the world that was suffering.
Yes.
So there could be an end. So there is a solution. But first it has to with prayer, and then to urge everybody to speak up, not be intimidated. You're not anti-Semitic. You can always point to the religious Jewish communities around the world. Speak up and let us get that we should not give up, to get our leadership to recognize, just like we did with the apartheid. They finally got the world uncomfortable, the leadership uncomfortable to support the apartheid, and it went away. And today, no child would comprehend that there was a fact that you had blacks were second-class citizens, or in the United States, in the South, it was second-class. Nobody can understand that it was possible that this was respected and accepted in the League of Nations, in the United
Yes,
Nations.
Reba Weiss, obviously you make a very, very good point there. And obviously we are running out of time. We've got about 8 minutes to go. And Professor Jeff Halper, if you could just unmute your button, please. Yes. And just looking at the international community and looking at the support base that the Israeli establishment or the Israeli government has right across the entire world. And we've seen it even recently with what has taken place in Jerusalem, what has happened in Sheikh Jarrah, in Gaza as well. And we see the type of language, we see the terminology that is obviously being used, and the victim mentality that Israel obviously is being painted with by international community, particularly when one looks at many of the European countries and also the United States of America.
Right. I want to back up for 1 second and say that religion is a double-edged sword, because, everyone's faith is absolute. That's a problem from my point of view with religion. But it isn't really absolute, because, Rabbi Weiss says this is Judaism, period. That's it. Well, there's a lot of other rabbis and other sects, ultra-Orthodox rabbis, modern Orthodox rabbis, Reform rabbis, that say, no, our Judaism interprets things differently. We have the same books, we have the same rabbis, we have the same Talmud, we have the same sources, but I have a different conclusion. Now, he was right in saying that at the beginning of Zionism, religious Jews were against Zionism, all religious Jews. But that includes Reform Jews. And that also includes secular Jews. The largest Jewish organization in the world, I think, was the Bund, which was a socialist, secular organization that was very anti-Zionist. So anti-Zionism, like I said, Zionism was a very small, tiny movement. But over the years, it grew. And what happened in the 20s and 30s was the ultra-Orthodox Jews that were here, the same people that Rabbi Weiss is from, that community of the ultra-Orthodox Jews that were anti-Zionists, got to a completely different conclusion, saying the same thing. The Almighty decides what's going to happen. So Rabbi Kook and some of these other rabbis said, well, if that's the case, look, Jews are coming to this country. They couldn't come here if God didn't want them to. There's a city called Tel Aviv. How could we have built Tel Aviv if God didn't want us to? The British, the biggest colonial power in the world, are supporting Zionism. Obviously, Zionism must have a divine blessing. Otherwise, it couldn't succeed. If, in fact, the Almighty decides, then how can we explain the success of Zionism? The tremendous success until today. So today, the majority of religious Jews are Zionists, including many ultra-Orthodox Jews. We have to remember this. The Mea Shearim, the ultra-Orthodox community, B'nai Brak, is kind of anti-Zionist. They're really in between, because they vote in Zionist elections, most of them. They take money from the Zionist government. They sit in the government. Now they're very upset because with the new government coming in, they're not going to have that same source of money. So, religious Zionists, including very ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionists, have really made peace with the Jewish state. They might not be Zionists in that sense, but they're certainly not against the state of Israel. They're very conservative. And remember, the settlers are 90% religious and Orthodox Jews. The new prime minister of Israel, for the first time, is going to be a religious Jew. So that we can't really, I understand where Rabbi Weiss is coming from, and from his point of view, that's his point of view. But he can't represent all the Jewish people, because the vast majority of Jewish people, whether they're secular or religious, in fact, accept Zionism, and not only accept it, but the religious Jews, for the most part, see Judaism. Zionism has to be blessed by God from that perspective, because otherwise, as Rabbi Weiss himself says, it couldn't succeed. So religion is a kind of a very slippery thing to argue political things with. What's happening is that what we have to do, just to answer your question in a second, is we have to make common cause with the Palestinians and begin to formulate a political program and understand, and we see it after Gaza, that world public opinion has shifted. In other words, Israel is very strong with governments, but we can't overestimate. I think the Palestinians make a mistake when they overestimate the strength of Israel. It's strong with governments because it sells military and security stuff and everything else, but it's very, very weak. It's lost it in the court of public opinion. So the people of the world, I think, are more and more with the Palestinians, but we're lacking that Palestinian leadership that formulates a political program and guides and focuses and directs that international movement. And that's really what we need now.
Well, thank you very much for that.
I know you're running out of time, but I must say that the ultra-Orthodox, what they call, or the very Orthodox, are totally not Zionists. They're anti-Zionist, and that point is totally not true. Around the world,
all their money from the Zionist government. Where do all the yeshivas come from? From the Zionist government.
What you said, modern Orthodox, what they use the term.
No. The Gur.
That's
Gur get a lot of their money from.
Okay. No, and the ones that are just like this Palestinian representation in the state, there are some Orthodox, so they have no way out, they say, so they have representation, but they don't hold of the government. They simply need, because they say they're dying from hunger if they don't have medical aid and whatever they have over there, or the food, but they don't agree with the Zionism. And that's beside the hundreds of thousands of others, and certainly around the world of these, well, simply the very Orthodox refuse to accept the legitimacy of the existence of the state of Israel. It's Zionist propaganda, what they sell you, that the Orthodox Jews around the world are the majority, are supportive of Israel. That's totally not true. It's bunk. You can go look around the communities around the world, and you'll find the very religious community. It's only the ones who call themselves modern Orthodox.
The ultra-Orthodox are in the government. Their parties are in the government today. The minister of
because they
health,
go there doesn't make them what they're not.
No, they're in the government.
The ultra-religious are not in the government.
Right, anyway,
they're not in the government. They're not there. They're totally not there. There's Eda Haredis, the God-fearing community. They're not in the government, and they refuse to serve. And the ones that are in the government, so the ones who are from these quasi-Orthodox, it's simply because they say they need representation. It's true. There are modern Orthodox.
Don't call the Gur quasi-Orthodox.
I told you quasi-Orthodox. They are not
the largest Hasidic group in the world. You're calling them quasi-religion?
Because if they're not following the Torah, what makes it? What makes you a Jew? If you are a Buddhist Jew or a Jews for Jesus, that's also Judaism. How does that work? Explain that to me.
Go ask the rabbi. Go ask the rabbi of Gur.
Yeah, their rabbis is a farce. That's why, because they refuse to accept the Torah. They made their own rabbinate and a chief rabbi, but it's a farce.
Obviously, gentlemen, we've run out of time, and obviously, we've lost a bit of focus on the discussion. But these are healthy discussions. Obviously, nobody's going to agree. We have the right to disagree as well. We have our own interpretations on how we see things and how we view things, and we do respect all the opinions. But Rebbe Weiss, and also to you, Professor Jeff Halper, as always, we appreciate. We thank you for your time. The last 2 hours have been most stimulating, a lot of food for thought as well, and I think a lot came out. Unfortunately, we lost a bit of power in between, and we lost Professor Rand Greenstein. But all the best to you, gentlemen. Take care. Please be safe, and we wish you well.
Thank you.
Thank you much. Good night.
Good night. Well, that's the panel that we had this evening looking at Jewish Voices for Palestine. And I must say, very, very interesting indeed. And we trust and hope that it has been equally interesting for you, the listener, the viewer as well. But for now, we're going to be signing off. And from myself and the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.